of course, they're in long dresses that were appropriate for the time. So they're out there in the fields. And if you think that preparing meals for this number of workers in the hot conditions that we have at harvest time around here was easy, that's not easy work. But this is absolute photographic evidence that women are deeply involved in this pretty heavy-duty type of work. So, flash forward, just like to give you a little context, some quick facts about our town, Moses Lake. We were called Nepal from 1911 to 1938. The group of women was behind the name change. There were a couple of reasons for the name change. Nobody knew Nepal, but everybody knew where Moses Lake was, and people just thought of this as Moses Lake. Nobody could spell it. Nobody knew what it meant. It was frequently mispronounced in a sort of rude way. So we got our name changed to Moses Lake in 1938. From 1911 to 1942, the population of this town bumped around 350 people. It's a very small town. It was a farm service town, so pretty much every business was directly impacted by the farmers and what they needed. So this would be town, and you'd come to town to get the things that you couldn't produce on your own farm. So you could buy equipment here, the things that you needed from a general store, but we would consider this an agricultural service town. So most of our early residents were farmers, fishermen, or they worked in some kind of business that supported agriculture. And you can see what we looked like back then. Here's a couple of old photographs. The street, this is after we got electricity. When we first got electricity, it was only available for part of the day. They would shut it off by midnight. Then you wouldn't have any electricity until the next day. So it was a very spotty type of service. We have our wide dirt streets here. And this would be your Safeway, your Winco, your Leprechaun Market, that's your grocery store right there. The Nepal Commercial Company, it was a red and white store, which was a chain of independent grocery stores all around the nation. So in a small town where you couldn't attract a big type of grocery store, they had these small independent red and white stores, and our Nepal Grocery Company, Commercial Company, was one of them. So this is an aerial view of our town. This is Nepal. It's really handy for a historian because if I come across something that says Nepal, I know automatically it was between 1911 and 1938, so I can place it pretty accurately in our history. And if I come across something that says Moses Lake, I know it was after the name change in 1938. So this is what a town of about 350 people looks like. From the air. And you can still see some features that are very recognizable today. I do like to point out this right here. This is the Grant Hotel, which eventually became the Moses Lake Inn. And here's a close-up picture of it. So this was the biggest thing going in town. It was 3 stories. It had an inn. It had a cafe. The post office was located in there. So this was the hot spot, I guess you could say, in Moses Lake. And we're going to come back to the Grant Hotel / Moses Lake Inn because it plays a key role in one of the amazing stories that I'm going to tell you today. There it is, looking pretty good. It was opened in 1912 and destroyed in 1939. So here's another aerial view of the town. This is a few years down the road. You can tell that the town has gotten bigger. You can also tell we're past the Nepal era because it says Moses Lake Wash. I've shown this presentation to younger people, and I asked them if you can find the location of Makosh Park in this picture. You guys think you can find it? You know where it is? Good. The Makosh Park is right there. Makosh Park at this time was known as Victory Village. So in that oval is housing for soldiers who have returned from World War II. We're starting the baby boom. They're looking to get married and start their families, and so this became sort of a temporary housing area in town.
So the construction workers that were in town,
Okay.
my cousin and his wife that lived there.
Awesome. Yeah, and there's still plenty of people around who grew up in Victory Village and have maybe fond memories, maybe not, of growing up there. But that's one of our nicest parks in town now. That's McCosh Park. I also asked the kids, do you see anything in this picture that's still in Moses Lake today? And you'd be happy, whoops, let's go back. You'd be happy to know that almost every kid in town can pick out the Stratford Road, the Alder Street fill right there. And so then I tell them Walmart would be up here in the upper right portion of the picture. And you can just see the very beginnings of the Knowles Vista neighborhood. So we are right at the cusp of our boomtown times, right at the mid-century when this town is just going to absolutely explode in population. And then of course, here's our Pioneer/Broadway corridor going around town, and here's our historic downtown in this area. Again, I love to look at all photographs. I could just stare at them for hours. You get all kinds of great information for them. So backing up a bit to the homestead times, Bertha Eccles, who became Bertha Eccles Guffin, was one of our early residents. And she was from what you'd call a homesteading family. And there's a picture of Miss Bertha there on the left with the check shirt in her hands in her pockets. So this is just an excerpt from an interview that she did, I believe, with the Columbia Basin Herald. And she talks about life during that time. She said life on the homestead was very hard. There was no electricity or refrigeration, no telephones or automobiles, and no running water. For years, she didn't even have her own well. Her family did not have their own well. They hauled water in barrels from their nearest neighbor's well. After we had a well dug, though, life was a little easier, she says. I bet it was. She could haul up our water in buckets with a rope and pulley, and we could use the well as a kind of refrigerator. We used to put our meat, milk, and butter and anything else that might spoil in buckets and hang them in the well to keep cool. Eggs were put in a large crock and preserved in water glass so that we would still have them during the season that the hens weren't laying. Water glass is a pickling lime solution. And when you mix it up, it's kind of clear, and you put the eggs down in there, and then they don't go bad as quickly. So this is very familiar to me because I came from a place in Northeast Tennessee, a really Appalachian town. And if you look at their history, people are doing the same kinds of things to get by. There's a lot of running water there in East Tennessee. They get about 60 inches of rainfall a year as opposed to the 6 that we get here. So pretty much everybody had, a spring nearby, a creek nearby, and you would use that as a source of refrigeration. You put your things that could spoil in a spring house or down in a basket in a cold running stream, and then they would keep them fresh a little bit longer. And I have heard of people using water glass. So, it's a very kind of American and rural type of story that Miss Bertha is talking about here. Yes, ma'am.
We use water glass.
Perfect. Nice. You have firsthand experience. And that's the thing, too, about this area, is that our history is not terribly long. If you talk about just the history of the town proper, when we became a town in 1911, we're just a little over 100 years. That's not a lot of time. So the stuff that I'm talking about is within living memory for a lot of people. And so I work really hard to get it right because I don't want to stand up here and say something that people in the audience know to not be true because they lived through it. So I'm always open to, corrections, but just please know that I try very hard, to get my facts straight. I love Miss Bertha. We're going to talk more about her as we go on. So here's an abandoned shack. This picture is taken in 1943. So this is somebody who came to the area, tried their hand at taming the sagebrush, and didn't make it. They gave up. And this was a pretty common story. When people first started coming here in the early 19th century, they experienced a few years of pretty good rainfall. And then that went away. And so, the people who had maybe started to make a go of a front family farm found that they just couldn't hack it when the rain went away. And so they picked up stakes and left. So this quote came from the Columbia Basin Herald, and it's another reminiscence of those early years. And they say, there were 3 children born on the Hanson homestead. When the youngest baby arrived, Mrs. Hanson was alone, except for her 2 other children herding the cows. By signaling with a white flag, they were able to bring help from the neighbors hours later. A wife never traveled to the doctor for childbirth. Some who tried had their babies arrive before reaching a doctor born in the vast area of sagebrush. Yeah, just having a baby wasn't something that warranted going to the hospital. First of all, there was no hospital. Second of all, it's just childbirth. It's like a normal, natural thing that women go through. My grandpa was born at home. It was just a thing that was done at that time. And also, if you try to leave the house, you might end up just delivering right there with the jackrabbits. So I found that a really interesting, just little snippet. The part about raising the white flag, they had a system, they had it worked out, and if everything went well, there would be a healthy baby. If everything didn't go well, you're not in a good area. It was not easy to get medical care at that time in this area. Childbirth is extremely dangerous for women, so that's one of the reasons that I put this little thing in here. Working women. So women have always worked, whether they receive wages for their work or not. It's just part of being a human, right? You've got to work to stay alive. You've got to work to provide for your family. But women who were in paid professions during that time, here's a really stark example of what the pay gap was like. So I came across this in my research. The pay for male teachers in 1909, which is the year we were created as a county, was about $69.84 per month. That's a little over $2,000 in today's money. For female teachers, it was $64.10, which is just it's about $200 less than the men were getting. And you might think, oh, yeah, it's not a big deal. It's only $200. $200 adds up, right? Paycheck after paycheck. $200 is a trip to the grocery store to feed a family of 4 for a week. Again, when I'm doing this for younger viewers and visitors, I give them some little facts here about the Nepal school. There were only 32 students and 4 teachers. It was a 2-room school in the very beginning. And then I asked them, why do you think women were paid less than men for doing the exact same work? Teaching, whether it's coming out of a woman's mouth or a man's mouth, it's the exact same work, right? And there were all kinds of silly reasons. They would say things like, well, men have families to provide for. I tell you that Mrs. Hanson, no, it wasn't Mrs. Hanson, it was Mrs. Eccles. Her husband up and left her with 6 children. She had a family to provide for. She took in washing. She did everything she could to keep her family from starving. So that's a pretty flimsy excuse, saying, oh, well, the men have a family to provide for. Women absolutely had families to provide for. Men left, men died. You cannot, just because you have a husband doesn't mean you're going to have one next week, right? So they were in need of money just as much as the men were. Another reason might be the education gap. There were a lot more educational opportunities for men than there were for women. So, you could excuse it that way, saying, well, this young man has a high school diploma and young lady, you do not. Well, he might have had an easier time getting to that high school diploma than a woman would have at this time. So we do a little talking about the pay gap and what the excuses were for it. And then, I'm sad to say that it still exists. There's still a pay gap between men and women. But, when I ran across that, I was like, well, there it is, just spelled out in black and white. You're worth less if you're female, right? Okay, so here's the Nepal School. One of the things that I love to ask people is, what can we learn from historic photographs? We can learn all kinds of things if we really dig into it. Thankfully, for us, someone has written 3rd and 4th and 5th grades, so this is 3 grades combined. Nepal School, 1925, Mrs. B.R. King, teacher. So there's a whole wealth of information there. I know which classes, what ages I'm looking at. I know the year the picture was taken. I know who the teacher was because someone thoughtfully put it down there for me. I know who took the picture, Simmer Studio in Wenatchee. So they had to send over to Wenatchee for a photographer to come for picture day. I love this picture because what do you wear on picture day at school? Your best, yes, thank you very much. You wear your Sunday best. So these little country kids are wearing their absolute best. And what are most of the little boys wearing? They're wearing overalls, right? That's their best. That's the best they've got. And you look at their hair, this little fella here, kind of right in the middle. His mom was like, I'm slicking that hair down, I'm putting goose grease in it or whatever I can. Don't you mess up that hair before that photographer comes. You can just hear those conversations. I wonder, did this little boy have a case of lice? He's got no hair at all. They had to shave it off or something. Something happened. But yeah, the expressions on their faces, what they're wearing. You look at their little shoes. They're just as dusty as can be. There's no pavement. There's no sidewalks. There's no asphalt. You know how dusty it gets out there, especially in the summertime. So I love photographs, and I love just digging into all the little details. It must have been spring because you can see up here in the window, they've got a little art project going on. They've got little tissue paper flowers or something going on there. So, it's a pretty simple, yawn. It's a class photograph. There's hundreds and thousands of those. But if you dig in a little deeper, you can really determine a lot more than you could by just the first glance. So yeah, this was Nepal School in 1925. Again, just showing you also the size of the community. That's all there were of the 3 grades. And this probably wasn't all the kids. There might be some kids who were at home farming and not going to school. What other jobs did women have? Well, we do have some pretty notable postmistresses. Our first postmistress for Moses Lake was named Jessie McDonald. And then Miss Bertha. So she gave us that quote about life on the homestead and not having a well and putting stuff down in the well to keep it cool. Well, she, as a young woman, she had several jobs. She became a hairdresser. She did farming and fishing. She did several other things. Eventually, she became the assistant postmaster for the Nepal post office, which is inside the Moses Lake Inn. So when the inn burned in 1939, she saved the mail. She was the acting postmaster because the postmaster was ill. He was upstairs in bed. He was recovering from a heart condition, I think. Well, she rallied the men who were standing around watching this hotel burn to help her get the mail, the postal equipment, everything out of there just as fast as she possibly could. At one point, she's overcome by fumes from like a refrigeration leak, but she shakes that off. And within an hour, she's back doing business. She's got the post office set up in a neighboring building, and she's back doing business. People warned her the upper 2 stories might collapse, so she's still running in there and pulling things out. She saved everything but like about $5 worth of stamps and stuff, and maybe 1 package. So I just find this a really incredible story for many reasons. First of all, why would she endanger her life like that to save the mail? Well, let's think about the world that we're living in here. There's electricity only part of the day. There's very little phone service in this area at the time, and it's not direct dial service. It's the old party line where you've got to connect to an operator and then get connected to where you want to go. There's telegraphs. Those are around. There's a train, so there is some transportation in and out of here. There's no interstate. There's no Highway 10 even. The mail is a crucial link to the outside, right? There's a reason it's a federal offense to tamper with the mail. People's important legal documents are coming through the mail. Their paycheck might be coming through the mail. Correspondence with people very far away. And this was a really isolated area, even more so than it is now. And so the post, saving this post, saving the mail, saving the equipment so that the institution could keep running even after its home burned to the ground was an incredibly heroic act. And it was a woman who did that. So I really think that was a great story. And of course, that picture there is the Nepal Inn on fire, burned to the ground. So this was 1938. She was a pretty young woman still. No, I think she was grown at that time because this was after her sort of hairdressing career. And so this, I think she was a bit older at that time, but she was not, I mean, she might have probably been in her 20s maybe. I'd have to go back and check her birth date and then, do that math, but so I just think that's cool. It's a really cool story. Farm wife. So a lot of the women at this time would have described themselves as a farm wife. And here's what farming is looking like. Early days, you might even be using a horse to pull your plow. And this is a picture from 1955 after sugar beets have started taking over everything. So the farm wife, this is a bit from an oral history that Wanda Hanson did. So she and her husband, Tub Hanson, were farmers before he became a state senator. And she just says, I did everything. I drove truck, I made lunches, I fed the hired people and my family. I used to drive truck during the harvest. She says she would cut potatoes for seed. She would help with irrigation. She was a gopher. You go for it if you need to get it. But I love this. I didn't have to milk the cow. I determined that if I did learn, I would have to do that, and I wouldn't do that. So she drew the line. She was like, look, I'll do irrigation. I'll drive your truck. I'm not milking those cows. I'm not getting up at 4 a.m. to milk the cows. So you got to admire that about Wanda. She had a limit. Can't blame her. But it just kind of shows the busy life of a farm wife. Farming is not a solo profession. It is a family profession, right? If you live on a farm, if you grow up on a farm, you're a farmer. Everybody does the farming. Yeah. Cool. I love that picture because she's just grinning so big there. And, it may be a staged photo. I don't know if she was out there all day harvesting sugar beets, but. Sure, yeah. Yeah, and this was her family's farm. So she definitely had, like I said, if you lived on a farm, you're farming. I also love this story. So this is Maggie Waltho. She was elected mayor of Soap Lake in 1946. She served from 1946 to 1950. I dug into her story a little bit, and I found a really great oral history on YouTube where her son is talking about her. He's passed on now. But we have this oral history, this recording of him on YouTube talking about Soap Lake early days, talking about her, and it's quite clear from his memories of her that she was kind of the boss in the family. He talks a lot more about her than he does about his dad. And she had this big personality. She was from Ireland. She came through Ellis Island in the early 20th century. She had a sister who was a nurse out here in Washington, so she made her way across the country. She studied nursing. She met her husband, who was also a nurse, and they were both working in healthcare. He had really bad asthma, and they noticed when they were in the Spokane area in our drier climate that his asthma got better. So they decided to buy this place in Soap Lake, and they opened the Waltho Hotel. She owned this business with her husband, had 11 rooms originally. They did all the cooking, everything. You could stay there for a week for about $25, and that was all your meals and bath and everything. She was known as tough but fair. When she became mayor, she made national news when she stripped. It was either the marshal or the chief of police. There are varying accounts of what his title was, but he got a little too happy in a Soap Lake bar and started waving his weapon around, so she took it. She took his gun and his badge, and she was quoted all over the country, actually, in newspapers saying, "A woman can run this one-horse town, and I'll do it until somebody better comes along." They asked her if she was going to carry a gun. She said, "Nope, Irish don't carry guns. If necessary, I'll carry a shillelagh." So she was just a really, strong lady, standing firm on her principles. She also stood up for the rights of the nude bathers at Soap Lake. There was sort of a nudist beach, and the county sheriff took it in his head to get rid of them. And she stood up for them and stood up for their rights to do what they wanted to do. The only concession was they had to put up a sign, beyond this point is a nude beach. So caveat emptor, buyer beware. One of the things I learned from the oral history that her son did was that she wanted to expand the business at one point. And so she went to the bank in Ephrata. There's no bank in Soap Lake. And she asked for a loan, and they took it to the bank board to decide. The bank board turned her down. Well, she had, could be. She had a friend who was on the bank board. His name was Shorty. He was a rancher. So she calls up Shorty. Says, "Next time you're in town, Shorty, why don't you come see me?" And so Shorty comes, and she just gives him up and down the road for I don't even know how long. "Why can't I get this loan? You better give me this loan. What reason have you got to?" Just on and on and on. And finally, Shorty said, all right, I'll do what I can for you. Just stop hollering at me." Any guesses whether she got the loan or not? She did. She got the loan. But she was not afraid. If someone told her no, she was not afraid to find a way to get to yes. So I have this sort of list of, as I'm doing historical research, these personalities that just pop up. I'm like, man, I'd really love to talk with this person, just to sit down and have an hour's conversation. And she's definitely at top of the list. I just want to hear her accent, for one thing. But also, she just seems like a real force of nature. She met Bess Truman when the Trumans came through on the train. She had a really interesting history. We also profiled Roxy Thorson. She was known as the Queen of the Salt Mine, and she owns Thorson's Soap Lake Salts. That business is still, the building is still in Soap Lake today, one of the historic buildings. So she and her husband also moved into Soap Lake in the early part of the 20th century. They bought this business, and then he promptly died. He died in the early 1920s. And so here she was, a young woman with this business to run. She could have sold it and pulled up stakes and done something else, but she did not. She kept running it. She improved the process by which they pulled water from the lake and dehydrated it to get the mineral salts out of it. And then she shipped Soap Lake products all over the world. And she really believed in the products and what it could do for people, because she was seeing it there firsthand in Soap Lake with Berger's disease. And other people who were seeing benefit from that mineral lake. She was quoted in the New York Times about the beneficial nature of Soap Lake salts and mineral salts. She was just an amazing lady. She lived well into the 20th century, I think, and she died in the 1980s. But she was one of the people, who built the reputation of that town. And ran a hugely successful business for many years. We can also claim a state senator who was a woman. So Miss Wanda Hanson, who talked about being a farm wife and driving truck, but not milking cows. This is her. I wish I had a better picture of her. I've been looking for a better picture of her. That's kind of a grainy one. But she, in 1991, her husband died unexpectedly, and she took his seat in the Washington State Senate. Her husband had been in there for quite a few years, and he was the ranking member of the Agriculture Committee. He was on other important committees like Transportation. So when she jumped in, she was jumping in for a pretty high-profile member. They were members of the Democratic Party at that time, and in this little snippet here, she talks about the responsibility and the weight of taking on this legislative seat. She says, I would take the bill home at night, I'd study it to see what the bill was out, I'd study until midnight or better every night trying to get caught up. And then she talks about the first time they took her to Tubbs' seat. She was just all of a sudden aware of the weight and the responsibility and the big steps she was taking. So she filled the rest of his term that he had vacated, and then she did not seek re-election. But she and her husband were definitely some of our notable citizens in the early days. Ranching. So if you're farming, farm family, you're all farming, and the same goes for ranching as well, because that's just farming livestock. This is a picture that was taken in 1952. It's signed up there in the corner, May Miller Wagner. And this is May right here on the left side of the image on horseback. And she's leading what might be the last cattle drive down Moses Lake streets. So she's not just a rancher's wife sitting at home making beefsteak or whatever. She's out there doing the heavy lifting as well. So she's helping herd this cattle down our streets. People ever wonder why our streets are so wide? That's one reason right there. They set them up because they knew cattle drives were coming through town periodically. And this would be Broadway right here. That's the old Turf Cafe. Say what?
They were that wide so they could turn a team and wagon around.
Yeah, there you go. She was the president of the Grant County Cowbells, which was like the women's auxiliary group of the Cattlemen's Association, but she was also a member of the Cattlemen's Association too. The Cowbells they started forming all these women's offshoots of these male organizations, and she became president of that, but she was also a member in her own right of the Cattlemen's Association. I love the club women history of Moses Lake and pretty much everywhere, actually. So the club movement was really important to the entry of women into public life. So we back up to the 19th century, particularly post-Civil War, you start seeing more and more educational opportunities for women. You start seeing universities admitting them, you start seeing women's colleges coming up. So it's easier than ever for at least white women to get access to higher education. They still didn't have the vote at that time, and it was still not really accepted to jump into public life. There was this weird idea that women shouldn't do public speaking. That would be terrible for me because I love public speaking. I love getting up and talking to people about things I know. And there was this conventional wisdom that a woman's name should only appear in the newspaper 3 times in her life: when she's born, when she gets married, and when she dies. Well, that's pretty limiting, right? You shouldn't do anything else that would be notable other than be born, get married, and die. But these women did not agree to that. So the club movement starts popping up in the 19th century, and it becomes an outlet for women to make direct change in their communities. And they kind of start out as more sort of feminine things like literary societies and stuff, but very quickly they pivot to political and societal action. So the Prohibition movement comes in large part from women's activism. just things that are going to uplift their community. And in Moses Lake, we see that directly. The Women's Club was our first club. It was established in 1914, just 3 years after we became a town. And they founded our town library. They're such a small town, very small tax base. They didn't have money for things like libraries. But the Women's Club saw the lack and the need in the community, and they just came together and they did it. Other clubs, another club that I love to highlight is the Nisei Club, because it's, this intersection of the Japanese American history in our town. It's also, talks about these first generation Americans and bringing their culture in, but also becoming American at the same time. They raised money for things like Samaritan Hospital. They raised money for new equipment for Samaritan Hospital. They raised money for scholarships for Japanese American kids. So, these women weren't just getting together and sipping tea and complaining about their husbands. They're doing things that are directly improving the life in the town and giving opportunities to the next generation. Yes, ma'am.
They made wonderful flower decorations.
I'll bet, yeah.
Arrangements, I should say.
Yeah.
They had booths out at the fair, and they had always entered these absolutely gorgeous flower arrangements.
Oh, well, yeah, I'm sure. I would love to see them, yeah.
And the Women's Club built their own building.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember where it is, down someplace. I don't remember exactly where it is.
Yeah. So
Built their own building.
that's very cool. Yeah. Nobody's going to do it for you, right? You just got to get out there and do it. So as their town grows and, we get to our boom years, we have tons and tons of women's clubs. So all of the male clubs like the Lions and the JCs, they had their women's auxiliaries. So you've got the JC Janes, you got the Lionesses. And let's see, who's doing more in town now, the Lions or the Lioness Club? Like that Space Burger booth is pretty popular because they've given millions of dollars back to our town. So, and they're organized around, a similar background or a similar, seeing things that are in need in town and similar interests. There was one club that was a welcoming club for newcomers. They were really busy for 20 years as this town is growing and growing and growing. So I love the club women movement, and I love that history just in general, and we see it right here in real time in Moses Lake. So some more pictures for you. We have several pictures of Ruth and Bertha in this car or around this car. They must have just gotten this car or borrowed it for a friend or something, because there's all these pictures of them posing like with this car. This might have been first wheels that they had access to. And this was taken on the C&O Fruit Ranch in Hiawatha Valley in 1927 or 28. This is a newspaper article that I came across, and they're talking about the carp fishing industry here in Moses Lake. And that's a really pretty picture, really pretty lady there. She's got her legs kind of crossed, and you can see why the photographer was like, let me get that shot. But if you look at the caption, it says, Miss Victoria Penhelick has just pulled 25 pounds of carp out of Moses Lake. So she was fishing. She wasn't just there looking pretty on the edge of the boat. If you don't know about the carp fishing in Moses Lake, it was a pretty big industry for a time. And those carp were packed on railroad cars and sent back to places like Chicago and New York, and where they would make gefilte fish, which is an Ashkenazi Jewish appetizer. But that industry no longer exists. The carp are still there, but the industry has gone away. So here's some more photos. Just, photographic evidence that women are out there doing the thing. This picture was taken by the Land Development Office of the Bureau of Reclamation when the Columbia Basin Project is coming in. So again, this might have been a staged photograph. This young lady is holding up these giant potatoes, but they're showing the potential of this region. And we know who she was, and it's got a great caption that tells me a lot about this photograph and the time it was taken. This one appeared in the Columbia Basin Herald. These two ladies, again, it's a staged photograph. They're like, look at this magazine and we'll take your picture. But the important thing here is that they're about to go to a women's business convention in Seattle. So this is 1960. So we're in the post-war period. You know, a lot of women went into the workforce for the first time during the war to help the war effort. And so the idea was when the men came back from war, the women would go back to the homes and they would not stay in the workforce. Well, that didn't happen. And then by the 1960s, we're really getting to the economic reality that a lot of families need to have two working adults. I grew up in a family where everybody worked. My grandmothers worked, both of them. We're getting to this point where the genie is out of the bottle. We're never going back to that sort of housewife, man only working, housewife raising the kids type of model. We are at the point where women are entering the workforce in numbers. And again, we're seeing that in real time in this little town. The town is growing, opportunities are growing. There's plenty of jobs for everybody, regardless of your gender. I saw a newspaper article and this guy was saying, yeah, Moses Lake is growing so fast, you can't even walk down the street. If you're in any kind of shape at all, you can't even walk down the street without being offered 4 or 5 jobs. So the work was there, not just for men, but also for women. Here's another couple of pictures. And, you know, I say that women are entering the workforce. They're also entering the workforce in very typically feminized professions. So teaching, secretarial work, nursing. These two women here were probably in the Women in the Air Force Corps. This was taken in 1952. It took until 1976 before women were admitted as full and complete members of the Air Force. That blows my mind to think about. That's within my lifetime. That's within a lot of us' lifetime. And it's, you know, this is very recent history. Most of the women in the Air Force served in medical or clerical positions. So again, we're in the workforce, we're still being paid less, and we're being sort of shunted into these really typically feminine, caring type professions. But things are changing, and they're changing pretty darn rapidly. And now these women have access to their own paycheck. They have some autonomy. They have a life outside the home, whereas they might not have in previous generations. We're also starting to see the demographics of our town change. In this caption here, it lists the ladies. There's a fellow Dolly, even though it's spelled wrong. That's my name. My way is the right way, right? I spell my name with an IE, and she's got the typical Y spelling there. But anyway, I digress. So we see Mrs. Ignacio Padilla. So we're starting to see the rise of our Hispanic community in this town post-war. That would say what?
Dolly would have been unmarried.
Right, exactly. Right. So a lot of times in these historic photographs, if we know information about them and there's a woman pictured and she's married, they'll put Mrs. Thomas Green. Well, where is she in that equation? We don't know her maiden name. We don't know her first name. So we really have to dig. You have to go into, like, you know, death records and stuff to find out who this person actually was and not just who her husband was. And that's really frustrating, but it's also, you know, the convention of the time. My grandmother was Mrs. Hoyt Copeland, period, full stop. You know, and things have changed since then, but yeah, you will see the women identified by Mrs. somebody. And I love these pictures here. This is one of my absolute favorites. This was taken at Warden. And this lady here is working on a potato project in agri-science. Agriculture is huge business in this area. So You know, you might discount this as like, it's working in a potato plant, like everybody does that around here. But this is crucial work for our area. There are millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars at stake on our potato crops. There are jobs, there are livelihoods, and you know, this lady's right in there doing the science part of it. I also love this photograph because if you look really closely, that's a bottle of ketchup right there. And that's a bottle of, looks like salad dressing. So, you know, another clue, even if we didn't have the caption of the photograph, there's another clue as to what she's doing. She's helping us grow the best potatoes and the tastiest potatoes for our area. And this picture here on the right, again, our changing demographics. These folks are riding in the county fair parade in 1968. And this banner here says Galciano. I may be mispronouncing that. This is a horse breed. I looked this up. They came from Spain originally. The Spanish brought them to Mexico. We started getting a lot of people from Mexico and Texas coming up here post-war for agricultural work and other opportunities. And they're bringing this horse breeding tradition with them and proudly riding in our fair parade in traditional costume. And this lady here is in her traditional dress on back of a Galciano horse. Oh yeah? Nice. Pretty horses. And then I end with our beauty queens. So these are some beauty queen photographs. We have an absolute ton of these types of photographs in our collection because they were newsworthy events, right? We had a pageant, we've got queens, we've got princesses, and everybody gets dressed up and smiles real pretty. But, you know, behind all of these women are these pretty smiles and these pretty dresses and these crowns and sashes are women with hopes and dreams and skills and stories of their own. So you got to look beyond the beauty queen typical, you know, facade to what else is going on. I love our rodeo queens here, up here, because these ladies, you know, this just wasn't about how well they could walk and stand and how pretty their dress was and everything. These women could rope and ride and take care of their livestock. You know, they were doers. They weren't just out there for show. And I love this picture here. Again, it shows our changing community. This is the Mexican Queen pageant. I love the smiles on the young people's faces. I love the little traditional costume here that the little boys are wearing. It's also a cautionary tale in doing history because this is a picture from our collection, and with the envelope that it came in had a caption on it that does not match what we're seeing in the photograph. So it was probably put in the wrong envelope. So I don't know as much about this photograph as I would like to know. It was probably taken at maybe St. Rose of Lima, you know, one of the Catholic churches in town. And it looks, if you look at the young man's tux there and the lapels and the collar, you know, the kind of shirt he's wearing, it's probably around the 1970s. But I don't have the same kind of caption for this photograph as I do for these others here. So that's one of the frustrating things. Sometimes you run across these really absolute gems and you just don't know a whole lot about them. And you put them out there and you hope that somebody can give you some extra information. But for this one, all I have, you know, is my visual information here of what's going on. But I'd like to end with the beauty queens and tip my hat to them and tell them we've come a long way since then. So that's the end of my presentation. I love to share. I have a real passion for this type of work. And I wanted to share just some things that I learned about our local history and the part that women are playing in it. And there's a saying in history, all history is local. And I firmly believe that because everything that's happening out there in the broader world ripples down to our little community. And if you look at this community, it has been kind of at the crossroads of some amazing events. The Great Depression, We wouldn't have Grand Coulee Dam without the action that the government found it necessary to take during the Great Depression, because that was built under one of those Roosevelt programs to lift America out of the Depression. The Columbia Basin Project. This was the largest public works project ever attempted. It was intended to irrigate over 1 million acres of land. That's enormously huge and audacious project. Moses Lake is right in the center of that. World War II. We've got a military base all of a sudden. We're training pilots that are going to go over to Europe and in the Pacific theater and win this war for us. Immediately after the war, now we're at the nexus of the Cold War. We become a site for the first generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles. That lands right in our backyard. You fast forward a few years, Mount St. Helens are up. We're right in the middle of that. So there have been some amazing things that have happened to this town and in world history that have had effects down in this town over the past 120 or so years. So I just think it's really interesting, and I like to bring it up. Yes. Your mother?
Started a business of gas stations, small convenience store, which is still going.
Mm-hmm.
But his mother worked there for years.
Right.
Yeah.
Or from 1991 to 2012.
Yeah, and you know, women did.
Started on 3rd Avenue and by corners on Pioneer Wheeler.
Mhm. Yeah.
Where the power station is.
And if someone had told her, you're just a woman, you can't be a business owner, what would she have said?
She probably wouldn't have much, but she was the silent generation.
Mm-hmm.
But she'd kick ass.
Yeah, exactly. You can't tell me that. I'm sorry. What? No. Yeah, so there's some amazing women, and we're all just standing on their shoulders for sure. So I thank you for coming today, and we'll wave to all the people out there in the world. And oh, you're welcome. I thoroughly enjoy it.
You looked at the photograph, the color there, or color like that, 75.
Sure. Yeah.
I might know these people.
You might. You might at that. Well, thanks for coming today, you guys, and listening to me. And if anybody didn't get to see it and wants to see it, it should be available on YouTube. And I don't know if Jenny's up there to stop the recording. It may just be recording until we're done. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate it. Shucks.